Hi everybody, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. In this video, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to share another one of my own personal experiences on the spiritual path, and that is my first experience of a past life memory, and also the sorts of synchronicities and events leading up to that experience of the memory. And this experience that I had when I was 13 years old, and it was a very formative experience for me on the spiritual path. It put me in many ways on the path that I continue to be on to this day. And it all began with what seemed like a telepathic communication with a god or a master, which could have just as easily been an archetype from the collective unconscious. But it led me to remember something which happened to me, but yet had never happened to me. And maybe in sharing my experience, you can think about profound spiritual experiences that you've had that have changed your life and set you on a new path. Maybe it'll start to get you to think about past life memories and whether you've had any similar memories arise. Some people say that past lives, the idea of rebirth, is just a load of nonsense, that when we experience past life memories, it's just a false memory. But whatever the case may be, if you have an experience like that, I think your unconscious mind is trying to tell you something important, whether it's something you need to heal from or something you're supposed to do in life that you haven't acknowledged. It's worth honoring those experiences, and that's why I'm making this video today. So first, a bit of background. How did this situation arise where I could remember a past life? Well, it all started in 2003, a few weeks or months after I'd started high school for the first time. I started to notice weird things happening around me. At first they were just little silly things, but then they started to escalate. So I remember walking around the school grounds and noticing a lot of ibises, which is quite random. Ibises in Australia are as common as rats or cockroaches now. They call them bin chickens because they become so much of a pest. But back then, seeing an ibis or a group of ibises was more of a novelty. So I found myself obsessed with these birds, these ibises. And it started as just a bit of silliness with my friends at recess and lunch. I'd point out the ibises, and then because I knew a little bit about Egyptology, which I'd learnt about the previous year at school, I decided that the ibises represented Thoth. And I started to proclaim that Thoth was trying to communicate with me. I'd never shown an interest in the god Thoth before. But this is in this spontaneous, playful state that I was in with my new friends. This is what I was coming out with. That Thoth was trying to contact me. And it was all just fun and games. Just a 13-year-old engaging in shenanigans. But as time went on, the intensity of the experience made me question it a bit. And I started to think, is there something more going on? Is there actually some energy that I'm being drawn to here? Because it does feel very intense. This spontaneous obsession with the god Thoth. And I started to take it a bit more seriously, but I still wasn't sure. So one night, as I was going to bed, I sort of silently put a question out there in my own mind as I was falling asleep. The question being, what is the meaning of all of this Thoth obsession that has begun to arise in my life? Is it just a load of nonsense, or is there something a bit more real that's going on here? Is Thoth trying to give me a message? And as I was falling asleep, I entered a kind of a dream. and I had a dream-like vision of the zodiac wheel, which I was kind of skimming over the top of from one side to the other, and I heard a voice, and the voice said, "Look on the other side of Pisces," and then I fell asleep. So in the time directly following this experience, I didn't really know what to make of it. I didn't know how to interpret what the voice said, but I was shocked that I heard it so clearly. And I thought about it some more, and then one day I was again sitting in my bedroom, and my gaze fell on my bookshelf, and I saw that there was one book there on astrology, which I must have bought at a New Age shop and just skimmed through once and then put away. But I noticed it was a book on Egyptian astrology. Egyptian astrology, for those who don't know, is very similar to traditional astrology, Chaldean astrology, but there's slight differences in the degrees of the signs, and rather than an animal or something like that, the zodiac signs are each represented by an Egyptian god. So I thought maybe this book had the answer. So I got it out of the bookshelf. I'd been studying the zodiac wheel in light of my dream, and I could see that the other side of Pisces probably represented the sign opposite Pisces on the wheel, which is Virgo. So I decided to look up the meaning of Virgo in Egyptian astrology, which I did, and I found that in Egyptian astrology, Virgo is Thoth. So the voice was telling me to look to Thoth. And so this was a really spooky synchronicity. It seemed to be verifying or confirming that there was some other influence that was trying to get through to me, and it was related to the Egyptian god Thoth. So now I was starting to pay attention a little bit, and I was really starting to believe that Thoth, for whatever reason, was reaching out to me and trying to get a message through to me. And so this was all percolating in my head, and I'd think about it on and off. And then one day, I had the memory. And it happened like this. One day, just out of the blue, I suddenly remembered that I had been in a scene which I had never been in before in my 13 years of being alive, but I remembered having been there. And the scene was this: I was a grown adult man, and I was in the desert. I was surrounded by rolling dunes on all sides, and I was sitting down cross-legged. I had a very simple robe on, the sort of thing that you would expect someone from the Old Testament to be wearing, very simple robes made from very simple fabric and roughly woven, which served the singular purpose of just protecting me from exposure to the elements. So here I was sitting down in the desert, and I seemed to be coming out of deep meditation. That was the feeling, sitting there in the desert. And the time was just before sunrise, in that twilight hour. It was very quiet and very peaceful. The only sound that I could hear was the whooshing or the whispering of the wind along the sand dunes. And everything had a sort of strange light to it. There was like a lilac coloured lighting which seemed to illuminate everything. It was very unusual. I've never seen anything like that before. But it was because of that twilight hour, and I could see the light from the sun about to come up, starting to illuminate the horizon, and I was just fully absorbed in the moment and fully content. And that was the memory. And I have to emphasize, it was a memory. It wasn't like a daydream or a fantasy. It was something I knew had happened to me before. That's how my mind experienced it. Something I had lived through, which I was reliving in my head, and the vividness of it had the same detail as a memory. And the familiarity that I had with that memory, the familiarity that I had with that scene was exactly the same as when you're recalling a memory. And what's more, as I reflected on the memory, I was able to make other associations of things that I felt or things that I'd known within the context of the moment in which that memory took place, the kind of the life that I lived in which that memory took place. And so I started to remember key pieces of information like where I was, which was Egypt, and when I was, which was pre-dynastic times. I was definitely in Egypt, but it was not ancient Egypt as we remember it. There was very little civilization around. It was still a very barren and mysterious land. There were still some people around, but nothing like what came later. It was something more archaic than that. And so I'd lived in pre-dynastic Egypt, and I remembered the Thoth connection, because I remembered that I had been a follower of Thoth. Not Thoth the god, as I originally thought, but I now started to remember that Thoth in those times was in fact a man who walked the earth and later on became so revered that people worshipped him as a god. But back then he was just a magician and a spiritual teacher. At this time in my life, I wasn't familiar with the story of Thoth Hermes Trismegistus or any of the sort of other stories to do with Thoth or Tahuti. But I, in my own mind, trying to come to grips with this reality that I remember comparing Thoth to Imhotep. In my study of ancient Egypt the year before, in school, and just reading books on the topic, I remembered that Imhotep was a great and powerful priest and a magician in Egypt who was so revered that he was later raised to the level of a god. And I thought, aha, this is exactly what happened with Thoth. And so that was the meaning of all of these coincidences. That's what all of the synchronicities was setting up. That was the message that I was supposed to receive, that I had spent this previous incarnation as a follower of Thoth in pre-dynastic Egypt. And things continue to escalate after that. The synchronicities continue to pile on after that. Shortly after I remembered all of this, my mum had a friend over who was sort of into New Age stuff, and just out of the blue, she started talking to us about this book that she had read. And that book was The Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. This was a channeled text which goes back to the 1920s. And the information that was purportedly channeled in this text talks all about how Thoth, who is remembered as a god, was in fact a man who walked the earth and lived in Egypt in pre-dynastic times and settled in Egypt, who began the first mystery schools of Egypt. And for all intents and purposes, invented magic and mysticism as we know it today, as it was adopted in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. And that is why Thoth is remembered as the god of magic and spirituality, as the god who brought magic to Egypt for the first time, who brought magic to the human race for the first time. And so this text corroborated everything that I had remembered, and that really got me to sit up and pay attention. So it's mind-blowing. So I'd had this memory of my previous life in pre-dynastic Egypt, and now I had to come to grips with what that meant. So I really used my intuition, and I was doing all of this when I was 13. I was a bit of a spooky kid, even back then. I used my intuition to try and figure out why I was remembering this life. What was the underlying message behind me recalling this past life? And I came to the conclusion that whatever I'm here to do in this life must somehow be related to what I was doing in that previous life and the oaths that I took to Thoth and whatever it is he's trying to achieve with the human race. And coming to that realization in the years to follow would be the thing that finally led me to magic. By exploring Thoth and what he represented to civilization, I would come across magic, and that opened a whole world up to me. And that set me on the path of spiritual development that has taken me through to the present day and made me into the person that I am today. And it all started with remembering that previous life. So it was very powerful. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit about my story, my journey, and how it started off and how I've come to this point. So if you have any experiences that you'd like to share, any formative moments in your own spiritual development that you'd like to share, leave your comments down below. If you've got an opinion about previous lives or past life memories, leave your comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.